Welcome everybody to ML Ops World, Machine Learning in Production Bay Area. Our speaker for this session is Stacey Svetlichnaya. She's a deep learning engineer at Weights and Biases, building developer tools for visualization, explainability, reproducibility, and collaboration in AI. She's not sure if the climate crisis or AI safety is the bigger existential threat, so she strives to maximize impact on both nobly. She enjoys the intersection of machine learning research, application, and UX, mostly for vision and language models, image aesthetic quality and style classification, object recognition, caption generation, and emoji semantics. Cool. Previously, she worked on image search, productionizing ML systems, and discovery and recommendation on Flickr following the acquisition of LookFlow, a visual similarity search engine. She has a BSc and MSc from Stanford in Symbolic Systems, focusing on neuroscience. Amazing. So this talk is entitled Reproducibility, Machine Learning, How Not to Repeat the Past. Welcome, Stacey, and I hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining me for this talk. I'm Stacey, and I'm a deep learning engineer at Weights and Biases, where I work on developer tools for machine learning. I've been training deep nets since 2012, and I've helped deploy and manage a few of them in production. And in the past few years, I've worked on a variety of projects, from fine-tuning ImageNet and Keras, to generating text in PyTorch, to semantic segmentation in FastAI, and some GANs and reinforcement learning. And my goal is always to deliver a beautiful and interactive and functional prototype of these projects as quickly as visually as possible. And so I'm often reproducing code from GitHub repos, trying to go through the analysis, trying to run a few of my own experiments. And in this talk, I'd like to share my experience from this to condense it into the most useful patterns and practices I've picked up for building reproducible machine learning projects. And at the high level, I find that the best practice is to track as much as possible, everything if you can, to set up a system that lets you easily find and recreate a past state of your workflow, to change just one variable at a time and then compare across exactly that change and see if that's what made the difference, and then to save and share your progress often, even if the only person you're sharing it with is your future self, so that you don't have to actually go back and repeat the past. And I'll be talking about general principles as much as I can that should be relevant to any framework or environment or any other context in which you're doing machine learning or deep learning. But I'll be using screenshots from Weights and Biases. It's also very general and versatile, and that's what I use for all of my projects. So tracking everything is my first recommendation. And I like to split this up into code, config, datasets, and models. And of course, there's a long tail, but I like approximating this as an experimental science. And when we're following the scientific method, we have a few distinct components, and these have nice analogies in the deep learning world. So the independent variables, the things that are changing across different experiments, different versions of our models for a particular task. And I might also call these runs, where a single run is an experiment at a particular setting for all of your hyperparameters. You know, these might be learning rate, batch size, which type of optimizer you're using, what baseline architecture you're fine-tuning from, etc. You might also put system details and hardware here, you know, how many GPUs you're using, what versions. The dependent variables, what you want to improve, these are your target metrics, you know, loss, accuracy, maybe precision and recall. They might be customized for different classes that you care about. The methods or protocol, this is your training recipe, this is your code. This might also include versions of particular dependencies and any scripts that you have, say bash scripts to connect to different steps of your workflow. And finally, the materials, and these are typically data sets or model checkpoints, and they could be any input and output files that are created by your training jobs, by your code. And artifacts is a common term for this. We use this at Weights and Biases, and other places use it too. And of course, thinking of it in these distinct components, is a nice abstraction. In reality, our models evolve and branch, and we create lots and lots of different versions. But I find that it makes it easier to think about this space of reproducing an exact same configuration, even though we're continuously exploring the space of possibilities. I left one thing off of this organization of the space, and you can throw some ideas into the chat for what you think is missing from this experimental scientific setup. I'll also just keep going because I have a lot of slides to go through. The part that's missing and really critical for this work is the notebook, where you're taking notes on these things that you're changing on your experiments. And ideally, this is a system of record that can track everything. And the reason it's important is it's the highest level at which you can collect insights across projects, across collaborators, across time. And that's really the meta-learning model that you, as a scientist, as a machine learning practitioner, are fine-tuning over time, where you can keep your meta-learning gradient updates and get better as you do more projects. And to achieve that, and even to compare any two particular experiments, let's say, do we set the learning rate to 0.001 or 0.002? We want to standardize logging as much as possible. And there are popular solutions for config metrics and code for this, right? For config, you might imagine just doing a basic diff. I have a dictionary of key value pairs. You know, my batch size is 32. My learning rate is 0.001. And then I change those, and I just simply track the changes as a diff. For metrics, you can just log to a file, and often folks will plot those and look at them visually. And finally, for code, you know, version control, GitHub repositories are very popular and standard. For versioning, especially data sets and models, there are a few more trade-offs I'd like to talk about. And what you choose will probably depend on your project. But there's a trade-off between being very structured and rigid about what constitutes a new version, what becomes a config or not, and being flexible. And inevitably, as you run more experiments, the things that you need to track will change. The format of your predictions, the classes you care about, all sorts of things might change. And I tend to lean towards flexibility for this reason. Another trade-off is high-level versioning versus granular versioning. To take an extreme example, if you created a new version of your data set for every single image that you added, that would be an overwhelming number of versions. I recommend some intermediate setting, or perhaps several levels of hierarchy, where you can give your models and data sets high-level names, but then also get specific about parameter versions, parameter settings. And that also gets into, you know, precision or recall, right? If you version every single time you train every single model, you'll have an overwhelming number of models and not be able to operate on them at a high level. But it also might be hard to find a very specific one if you don't track everything. So here I would bias towards recall and tracking as much as you can. And there's some desired features for versioning that we might want. Of course, we want our versioning system to be reliable. When we log something to it, we want to make sure it stays there and doesn't change and accurately captures any differences between versions. We want it to be easy to annotate, so to take notes on what might have changed in this version. Let's say I balanced the data across classes, or I cleaned up some incorrect labels of a particular kind, right? The next requirement is having it be easy to share. If I'm working with multiple teammates, I would love to have everyone download the exact same version of the training data and not worrying about emailing around model checkpoint files. Ideally, this process is automated and also traceable, so that I don't have to think about the connections between a particular step of my workflow, the inputs and outputs, the next step, the next outputs, but instead that's all implicitly and deeply linked, and I can step through it. Maybe it's even visual, maybe simple to use, and you can imagine a long tail of other features for this versioning system that you might set up, but hopefully at least some of these are present. And I'll give some concrete examples from Weights and Biases where you can track each run of your script, and you'll get an overview tab for the run. Again, we're trying to log everything or as much as possible, so you'll see the hardware setup, the exact command that you ran. If you're running from a Git repo, you'll also see the Git command to restore exactly that state. We save a patch file with any uncommitted changes, which is really important because sometimes it's hard to commit very regularly. And for a notebook, you could save all of the session history, right? And this lets you get around the issue with notebooks where you might be rerunning the same cell with different values. You just save everything. You can then play it back and revisit it exactly in the order that you ran the cells. For Git repos, you can create a nice diff. And then if you have different versions of your model code, you can see exactly what changed. This is a trivial change here, but I hope it illustrates the point. For tracking the connections and the steps in this workflow, you might build up a lineage graph or a series of steps. So here I have an upload job that creates my raw data set. Then from that raw data set, I read it into a data split job that creates a balanced data set, which then gets trained on by several model variants, and those all get saved. Those are then read in along with the test data into inference jobs, which save test results. And ideally, I can just see all this without needing to think about the details of logging in each step. It's the automated component. So once we have a setup like that, that should make it easier to find and reproduce and precisely copy a prior workflow state. And in order to do that, generally, how would we reproduce an experiment? We want to find, the exact same config. So those are the hyperparameters we checked. Look at the exact metrics. It's the same definition of our custom loss function or whatever it might be. The exact same code. So hopefully that's the last commit from our Git repo and the right cells in our notebook. And then finally, the artifacts, which are file paths for our training data. Of course, the local instances of those directories, or perhaps they're not local, but they need to be actual files that are living somewhere, right? And if we can match all the right settings, it's almost like we can have any spreadsheet or grid that leads us to the exact right combination. And hopefully that will be a perfect match for the experiment we previously ran, or if we're trying to reproduce someone's results from published work or a GitHub repo, right? They should match exactly. What happens in reality is it's hard to find the correct values for some of these things, or even figure out what they should be. Config often gets partially stored in code when we're trying to move quickly, right? You reset the learning rate inside your training code, and then you forget to move that hyperparameter into config. Metrics often evolve as you experiment. For example, you might start out looking at accuracy for semantic segmentation, but then realize that intersection over union is more useful, especially for certain classes that you might care about more. Do you redo all of those prior experiments that didn't log that metric? And that's a decision that depends on the project. For code, as I mentioned, you might not be committing super regularly, and then it's hard to go back and see all the individual places you might have changed things. And for notebooks, because of the nature of rerunning cells, there's not much structure, so it can be hard to return to the exact same order that you ran things in. And finally, for artifacts, because they're these file paths, often they're partially stored in code and config, and they're hard to isolate from these other parameters that you're trying to keep fixed. And they really rely on naming and discipline. Often one can end up with multiple versions, training data underscore final, training data underscore best underscore final, v20, maybe the date, maybe the number of items. And it's possible to do that in a disciplined way, but it is challenging. And the helpful pattern that I've found here and that I'd like to recommend is having a good workspace. And I know a good workspace is a very general term. I find that it's a balance of having access to everything that you might need, right? Everything that we've logged in the previous stage, potentially, but also being able to focus on just the parts that you care about at a particular point. So it needs to be customizable, so you can choose the set of experiments or the set of hyperparameters that you care about at any given time and really focus in on those and not have the noise of all the other stuff that you might have logged. So for config, that means taking all of our experiments and having them accessible in one shared workspace, and ideally being able to group and organize and visualize custom subsets of that run space. For metrics, it means adding them as you come up with new ones to that same workspace. For code, doing the best you can with commits is great. In weights and biases, we also have a restore command that, if you've already logged a run, lets you restore that exact state in one line. For the notebook, we have that code tab, which can run through your whole history. You can, of course, download that also. And for artifacts, this automatic lineage graph really sets you up to easily annotate particular versions, easily compare them, reference them with pointers that you can decide on, such as best or production. And you have a default one called latest, which is always the latest version uploaded. And I'll show some examples of what this might look like. And this might be different if you're in a different setup, but here I'm comparing a bunch of model submissions for a semantic segmentation challenge where different teams have logged their predictions on the same unknown secret test data. And you can sort by different metrics. You can group by different metrics here, just showing, false negatives, false positives, intersection over union across category. And this lets you see at a high level how the different teams are doing. If you're working as a solo practitioner, these teams might just be different model variants. And that's the case here. I have a very different dashboard, and I have videos from training and validation embedded in this dashboard. I might care about, in this case, it's a reinforcement learning problem, the reward or the length of each episode, and I can customize which runs show up in which section. And this makes it easy to find a particular run. Here, going back to the semantic segmentation problem, I have a high-level overview. I can sort all of my runs by, say, traffic accuracy to see, which one performs best. And then I might decide that I want to consider car accuracy as well and see if that's a different model. I then can sort by car accuracy, get the highest performing model there, and I still have all of the config and the metrics available here so that I can start to generalize about how these parameters might affect some of my models. And very briefly, I can also continue to customize this with different colors, different views, and all of this helps me generalize across different experiments. I have another quick example of comparing the run code to see what differences across two experiments might have led to my different results. And also digging more into the details of why model predictions might be different. Here, we're taking two of those models from that first example and looking for a particular test image at their predictions, right? And you can see that Janet's model here gets some red sidewalk, whereas Bob's model does not. And in the UI, you can click through this interactively to see exactly what model Janet versus Bob trained, what the training images were, what all of the parameters were, what the base network was that they were fine-tuning. And if you were to click through all of this, you could see that they're using different versions of Resonant 18, perhaps compare the parameters explicitly. And all of this is tracked in this lineage automatically so that you don't have to do a lot of manual digging. To make it easier in the general case, you want to compare across changing just one variable at a time. And also that applies to changing just one of config, code, or data. This is a pretty straightforward intuition. If we're trying to follow the scientific method, we want to make sure that changing that one variable is what affects our results, that our insights are then reliable. So in both training and evaluation, you can vary the config only by changing the values of hyperparameters. And here I'm showing the differences between two models, and these are kind of toy convolutional neural networks training on fashion undness. The baseline model parameters just get doubled, some of them the 2 layers and the learning rate, and the double model. And then I know that my code, so the actual training process that defines those, is fixed. The training data is fixed. And the only difference across these two is the config. And then I can look at loss, I can look at accuracy and other metrics. I could also choose to vary only the code. And here I have a good example of that blending of code into and out of config, you'll see that some of these parameters are logged correctly to config across 2 runs, but then at the very bottom, I have a different setting for how much of the data I use, 0.2 versus 0.5, and that's not captured in config. And that kind of change can be easy to do in the process of hacking, but then hard to find later unless you're also tracking the code. Finally, for changing the training data, you can simply version each time you do a run or one of your experiments. And then here I'm trying out different splits, perhaps. 80-10-10 is a very common one, but I have different sizes, different total counts of items. And with the compute graph, I can actually see, here are all my attempts at splitting the data. Here's a particular split. And from that one, a bunch of runs generate predictions. And I can browse through those and be sure that those changes are the only ones that I'm varying in my experimental setup. I can also, choose to balance data or not, choose to annotate these in different ways. And this lets me iteratively refine, annotate, and standardize workflows so that I can get to a more and more rigorous setup that is then easy for others to reproduce, whether on my team or beyond. Finally, I can interactively get to a setup where the only parameter that I'm varying is the training data. So here I've filtered down my workspace. I've trained a bunch of different versions of the baseline model and the double model that I've described. And you can see here that the config is all the same across them, but the training data is what's varying. I can look at loss, I can look at other metrics, I can see how this fits into my compute graph. And this leads me to the process of comparing, right? As we're varying one thing at a time to train these model variants, we then want to evaluate them such that we're comparing apples to apples, a case where only one of these things was varied. And in a similar view, now we're looking at the double model. I can filter down to only cases where we've trained the double model, so the code is the same and the config is the same. And then I can further filter for the training data to be the same. And then the only variance is in the test data. And here I can color code my test data such that you'll see the most red for the smallest data set, and then as it's getting bigger, it'll get towards yellow. And I can compare across classes and see what the distribution of guesses was in my confusion matrix. And this lets me really focus in on what change the test data set made. And that kind of isolates the problem of reproducing and worrying about all of the other potential changes. You can also see this in the compute graph view. And again, I can click into these and see the details of each step of the pipeline. One last view that I don't have time to fully demo, but is very powerful, is setting up a table. Here, hopping for a moment to regular MNIST instead of fashion MNIST. On the left, I have predictions from a double model, and on the right, from the baseline model. And remember, the double model just has some layer sizes in the learning rate, doubled from the baseline model, just for illustration purposes. And these run the same code, so only the config is different. And the training data and the test data is the same. And here you can see that, for example, for when the models guess 0, the baseline model makes 39 mistakes, and the double model only makes 6. And for 1, the baseline makes 22, and the and the double model only makes 6 again. You can also see the distribution of ground truth classes, and this mode of comparison lets you get really detailed about what changed between the two models while knowing that everything else is fixed. You can also use this same UI to define new metrics from stuff you've already logged, like averaging across class confidence scores is the example I have here. And I'm going to keep moving quickly through the rest because I'm getting close to time. Once you have this set up for really precisely changing just one thing and comparing across just one thing, it's important to actually save and share this progress incrementally. And why is that important? Even if we could perfectly reproduce all of the code, config, and data, the relevant insights that we got might get lost. And we don't want to have to repeat all of that work, even if we can do it perfectly, or we can just hold on to the insight, because that's what ultimately matters. And it's powerful to be able to ask questions dynamically from this data as we've logged it, and then save those answers incrementally, right? So you don't have to worry about finishing up enough work to make it worth documenting, and documenting that in some particular way. That is a slow and sometimes difficult process. Instead, what if you could just have the dashboard be its own documentation that is always an evergreen state that is your most recent work, that is then easy to export, easy to share with others, and lastly, that it remains interactive and fully connected to the actual code, the concrete training inputs, the workflow history. All of these details that you've been logging can be continuous with the story that you're presenting. And that is what is available with reports and weights and biases. You can dynamically explore all of the stuff that you've logged, group it by all of these config fields, these artifact names, all of this setup, right? And then when you've reached a nice configuration that maybe highlights some comparison between the baseline and double model, you can simply save a snapshot as a report. And here I just have a few examples of the diversity of things you could log: 3D molecules, bounding boxes, and all of this is interactive so that readers of your report, it could be your teammates or someone else in your organization, or it could be the general public, could go in and ask a question like, what happens if I sort these predictions by a different hyperparameter? What if I compare these models on a different metric? And that interactivity really enables collaboration and the whole field to move faster. Here I have, I'll just show one quick example of a report where there are 3 different types of reinforcement learning agents, and a reader can go in and check the box for all 3 types, and then update all of the charts to see all 3. This is, of course, a really simple example. You can get much more complex. If I plot specific accuracies of different models, I can then click on these run names to see the actual code that ran, all of the metrics for them, all of the config diffs here, and compare exact text generated across 2 different model variants, and really richly tell the story of any experiments and any projects that I did to not have to go through this slower process of documenting, writing up a paper, having the code separate. Instead, it's all in one unified framework. Hopping really quickly through some more examples here just to showcase the variety of deep learning models and views that you could put into the system. And want to end on how this helps us approach reproducibility, right? Regardless of what platform you're using, tracking as much as you can sets you up to not have to repeat the past. Setting up a good workspace where you can access everything that you've tracked, but also focus exactly on the subset that you care about, customize those visualizations, and really only be looking at one aspect of your model that you change at a time. Then compare precisely across that aspect so that you know that any improvements in results that you get, or any bugs, are due to that thing that you changed. And save and share progress often, which is most easily done if that's all continuous with the code and the work and the config. And that's it. I have some links to resources here, and looks like I might have 1 minute for questions.
Could you put your links to resources back? We have a couple more minutes. They're not that strict unless you want to run off to other sessions. But
great, thank you.
This is so beautiful with the experimental science. I do curriculum development, and And hacking is really fun, but there's a cognitive load too. And if you really want to go for the insights, it's so nice to have that cognitive load kind of lifted off of you so that you can really focus on that generalization that you were talking about. And it's so beautifully set up. It's such a nice way to relate it to something that we learn in elementary school with basic scientific experimentation and the discipline that goes into that. And if you really want to do interesting work, you have to have that discipline, right? So we have a question from Juan. How do you keep track of versioning when using training time data augmentations? Did I say that right? When using training time data augmentations. In other words, data samples not originally available before launching the training.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you might do a couple of things. One thing you could do is version the way that you do the augmentation, right? If you have some constants or parameters for how much noise you add, on what axis you share or stretch or crop or do something to the image, then you can store those and maybe that's sufficient for your purposes to see which augmentation method is better and you don't need the exact images. Another option would be to generate those, and every time you generate them on the fly, log perhaps a subsample as an artifact, as a new version of the data set. And again, that would depend a lot on your use case. I think it's probably not necessary to version every single one, but you may want to if that ends up being super critical to your application.
So we got to thank you, Stacey and Marnie. Yeah. Thank you for your question. We love questions. What next? What is it you're focused on now?
So right now I've been working a lot on the tables feature, and we're trying to make it support larger and larger data sets so that you can interactively ask questions about your data in the UI. Instead of having to rerun scripts. That's the biggest area. And then, all of these dashboard views that I was showing you, that's still a lot of work to set up in Weights and Biases. So we are working on making that easier to have templates for common use cases. For, here I want to see the top false positives of my model, or here I want to, really, really compare between two architectures. Should I use a ResNet or a multi? And how we can make that easier for users.
That's great. I don't know if it's John or Jan is asking, when can we buy the book? That's lovely. I agree. I would read a book of yours for sure. I love your existential philosophical neuroscience mind. Any general literature recommendations here, which is a question I love. So, I mean, nice resources that you've listed, John. So take a look at those. But I guess he's asking more specifically for literature recommendations.
Yeah, thank you. And definitely those resources, if you go to some of those, or also I realized on a different page is our Fully Connected community. It's a series of, it's actually a gallery of reports. So I was showing screenshots of those, but you can really dig into and experience them for yourself, click through to the runs, etc. I'm going to go with the philosophical existential take for a second. I recently read The Alignment Problem by Brian Christian, and I think it talks about, at the highest level, what we're trying to do with AI and what some of the challenges are, especially for reinforcement learning and recommendation systems.
Excellent, amazing. I also like the link that you posted that you can dive in and have a play with it. Where do you think your neuroscience training has impacted your, and we're getting a thanks, has impacted all of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's lots of analogies that folks have been making for a while between, the brain is a neural network and an AI algorithm is similar to a brain. And if we set up, networks that are similar in architecture to the way our visual system in the brain processes information, will that give us better results? And that's definitely stuff that I like to think about. I think also explanations and abstractions that are useful or not is a realm that I spend a lot of time figuring out how to communicate some of these things, how to make a good UI for things that are, really, really complex and really, really custom for a particular problem, like annotate all the pixels in this image of a car from a dashboard, right? Versus identify whether this is a particular species of plant in this photo. And I think it's useful from the neuroscience background to have the same level of complexity and possible levels of explanations where we can talk about what's happening. So just fluency with that.
Yeah, I went to a talk at in Toronto here with Professor Hinton, Jeff Hinton, and one of the top neuroscientists, and it's one of the coolest talks I've ever been to in my life, with the two of them going at it. So it would be something you would have loved, I'm sure. Anyhow, that was fantastic. There's so much there, and I'm definitely going to look at your resources in the book. And I don't see any more questions, so I thank you so much, Stacey. And I encourage everyone to check out the WOVA app to network with this wonderful community. And there's meetups and job boards. Oh, and we're getting clapping for you, so that's fantastic. That was super interesting. I do hope you write a book.
Thank you. I will. I really appreciate that. I really want to make more time for writing, so it's good to hear that.
Yeah, you've got that creative, and that you've got the beautiful blend between the multiple ways of thinking on detail and then high level, and just a wonderful blend of capacities. So it's super interesting to hear it from that point of view. And John, he's clapping too. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participating. And thank you so much, Stacey. And can't wait to hear what you come up with next year.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Bye.
Bye, everybody.